They were 19 when they embarked. They returned with 40 in their souls. Can you imagine what that means? Think for a second. What would you do if you woke up every night hearing screams that only exist in your head? If every door slamming made your heart race as if you were back in that green hell? If the smell of burning gasoline instantly transported you to a place you swore to forget, but that never ever forgot you? This is the reality for thousands of young Americans who believed in honor, duty, and patriotism. They embarked for Vietnam with shining eyes, impeccable uniforms, and photographs in the hands of girlfriends and mothers who promised to wait. They were boys who barely knew how to shave properly, who dreamed of returning as heroes, of building families, of living the life their parents had built for them. But war doesn't care about dreams, and Vietnam wasn't interested in giving them back who they were. Have you ever stopped to think about the weight a war carries on someone's soul? I'm not talking about the medals, the stories told in books or Hollywood movies. I'm talking about the veteran who returns home and can no longer sleep in the dark. The soldier who sits down to dinner with his family and, suddenly, is back in the jungle, seeing the face of the friend who died in his arms. I'm talking about the nurse who saved dozens of lives, but who wakes up in a cold sweat, tormented by the hundreds she couldn't save. Vietnam wasn't just a war. It was a collective nightmare that destroyed an entire generation of young Americans. And the cruelest part of all? When they returned home hoping for some kind of solace, recognition, a hug, they were met with spitting, hostility, and silence. The country they fought for turned its back on them. Families didn't know what to say. Friends had moved on. And they were trapped between two worlds, one that rejected them and another that haunted them every night. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. Because this story isn't just about destruction. It's not just about trauma and pain, although it has a lot of that. This is a story about rebirth, about men and women who went to hell, who hit rock bottom, who lost everything, including the will to live, but who somehow found the strength to get up, to rebuild, to transform the unbearable weight of war into something that could save other lives. Have you ever been through this? Have you ever felt so broken that it seemed impossible to put the pieces back together? Then you'll understand the magnitude of the miracle these people performed. And if you haven't yet, perhaps this story will prepare you for when life knocks you down. Because we all, at some point, face our own Vietnams, our own internal wars, our own battlefields where the only choice is between giving up or being reborn. Today, you'll meet real people, veterans who carried the weight of a war the world preferred to forget for decades, who fought against addiction, depression, guilt, and rejection, and who, against all odds, found a way back. Not to who they were before, because that was impossible, but to who they chose to become after hell. And it all begins with a promise that turned into the biggest trap of their lives. And it all begins with a promise that turned into the biggest trap of their lives. Before we continue, I need to ask you something. If this topic resonates with you, if you've ever felt the weight of carrying something that no one else can see, please leave a comment below describing what has touched you the most so far. It could be a word, a phrase, a memory. It doesn't matter. What matters is that you're here, and that already means something. Do you know why? Because your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who need to hear stories like these. Every comment, every like, every subscription isn't just a number on a screen. It's a way of saying that these stories matter, that these lives matter, and that you believe transformation is possible even when everything seems lost. If you're not already subscribed, click below now. Not because I need more subscribers, but because you deserve access to more stories that can change your perspective on pain, resilience, and rebirth. And if this video is touching you in any way, leave a like. This helps the algorithm deliver this message to those who truly need it. Think about it. Maybe there's someone right now looking for a reason not to give up. And this story might be exactly what that person needs to hear, so I'm counting on you. Comment, like, subscribe. And now, let's go back to those 19-year-olds who embarked on this journey believing in a promise. It was the late 60s and early 70s. America was divided, but for many boys in the country's interior, serving was simply what real men did. Their fathers had fought in World War II and returned as heroes. Their grandfathers had built this country with their own hands. And now, it was their turn to prove their worth. It was the late 60s and early 70s. America was divided, but for many boys in the country's interior, serving was simply what real men did. Their fathers had fought in World War II and returned as heroes. Their grandfathers had built this country with their own hands, and now it was their turn to prove their worth. The recruitment letters arrived in the mail promising honor, patriotic duty, and heroism. Serving your country was the right thing to do. There was no room for doubt. It was almost automatic. You turned 18, received the summons, and went. Simple as that. And for many, there was even a certain pride in it. Think of the social pressure at that time. If you didn't go, what would your neighbors say? What would your father, who had fought in the Pacific, think of you? The decision to embark was not just personal, it was a public declaration of character. The farewells were emotional. Mothers crying at the airport, hugging their children as if they could protect them with the strength of that embrace. Girlfriends promising to wait, holding photographs that would be kept in pockets of uniforms stained with mud and blood. Fathers shaking hands firmly, saying things like, "Make us proud," and "Come back in one piece." There were American flags waving. There were tears. There was a brutal innocence in those young eyes that did not yet know the smell of the Vietnamese jungle, the sound of a body falling beside them, or the deafening silence that comes after an ambush. They embarked believing they would return different, yes, but better, stronger, more manly. The hidden truth behind that promise was that they would return different in ways no one had prepared them to understand. The journey that began there was not just across the Pacific Ocean. It was a journey into an abyss that would change every fiber of who they were. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because the contrast between expectation and reality was so brutal that even today, decades later, many of these men still haven't been able to fully process it. When the plane landed in Vietnam, the first thing that hit you was the heat, not normal summer heat. A suffocating, humid heat that clung to your skin like a second layer. The air was thick, full of strange smells. Rotting vegetation, kerosene smoke, sweat, and fear. Yes, fear has a smell, and you learn to recognize it quickly. The first few days were utterly disorienting. Everything was green. The jungle swallowed you whole. There were no clear front lines like in the wars their parents had fought. Here, the enemy could be anyone. A child selling fruit on the road, an old peasant working in the rice paddy, a hidden tunnel beneath your feet. Paranoia wasn't optional, it was survival. And this mentality of constant distrust began to corrode something fundamental within these young soldiers. The ambushes were invisible until the first shot. You could be walking on patrol, quietly talking to your partner about the girlfriend you left at home, and the next second, the world exploded. Shots coming from all sides, screams, confusion. You'd throw yourself to the ground, covered in mud, trying to understand where the fire was coming from, trying not to die, trying to protect the guy next to you who, 3 seconds ago, was showing you a picture of his sister. And then you saw it. The blood. Real blood. Not the clean, dramatic, cinematic blood. The visceral blood, spurting out, staining everything, with a metallic smell that clings to your throat. You saw your friend, that kid from Oklahoma who had just turned 20, lying on the ground, his eyes still open but already empty. And you had to keep shooting, because if you stopped to process it, you'd be next. This was the truth no one had told. There is no glory when you are covered in mud and blood that isn't yours. There is no heroism when you are trembling uncontrollably after combat, vomiting everything you ate because your body can no longer hold it in. There is no honor when you have to leave behind a wounded comrade because carrying him would mean the death of the entire platoon. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. In a matter of weeks, those bright-eyed boys transformed into men with empty stares. The trauma didn't wait. Each day was a test of how much their minds could endure before they began to crack. And for many, the cracks began early. Nightmares, hallucinations, outbursts of anger, a disturbing silence that took over when they had free time to think. But the worst was yet to come. Because eventually, if you survived long enough, the day would come to return home. And that should be the happiest day of your life, right? The day of liberation. The day you would leave hell behind and return to the arms of your family, to the safety of your city, to the life you had put on hold. But that's not how it was. When the plane landed on American soil, there were no bands playing. There were no grateful crowds. There was no recognition their parents received when they returned from World War II. Instead, there was hostility. There were protesters at the airports shouting "murderers." There were people spitting on them, turning their backs on them, treating them like villains in a war they didn't choose to fight the way it was fought. Think about the absurdity of it. They fought for the country that rejected them. They gave years of their lives, saw friends die, carried traumas that would never fully heal, and returned home as outcasts. America was divided over Vietnam, and these young soldiers became the easiest targets for collective anger. They didn't make foreign policy. They didn't decide to invade or escalate the war. Many were forcibly drafted. But they were the ones who bore the blame in the streets, at family dinners, in job interviews where they were looked at with suspicion. The loneliness that followed was devastating. These veterans had no place in the world. They couldn't reintegrate into civilian life because everything seemed absurdly trivial compared to what they had lived through. How do you care about the local football team when you've seen people being blown up? How do you talk about the weather when you've spent months living under tropical rain, expecting death at any second? They couldn't sleep. The slightest noise made them jump out of bed, ready for combat. Slamming doors turned into gunshots. Fireworks turned into explosions. The smell of burning gasoline instantly transported them back to those cursed jungles. The war continued inside them every night, in endless loops of terror that no one else could see or understand. And because nobody wanted to talk about Vietnam, they were stuck with all of that inside. Families would say things like, "Try to forget about it," or "It's over, move on." But how do you forget? How do you move on when a part of you died there and never came back? When you did things that haunt you? When you saw things that no human being should ever see? The suicide rate among Vietnam veterans skyrocketed. Alcohol and drug addiction became epidemic. Many ended up on the streets, homeless, hopeless, without purpose. Society had turned its back on them, and they saw no way out. The weight of guilt, trauma, and rejection was simply too great. That's exactly what happened to Mike Sullivan. Mike was from Detroit, a working-class kid who had grown up with the American dream hammered into his head. Work hard, serve your country, build a family, be a good man. At 19, he embarked for Vietnam, believing every word of that promise. 13 months later, Mike returned. But the Mike who returned was not the same one who had left. He had seen things he couldn't recount. He had done things that haunted him every night. And he discovered that heroin, which was easy to obtain in Vietnam, was the only thing that silenced the screams inside his head. When he set foot in Detroit again, Mike was already addicted. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a matter of psychological survival. Without the drug, the flashbacks were unbearable. With it, there were at least a few hours of emotional numbness. But addiction is a bottomless pit, and Mike fell into it headfirst. In the first few months, he tried to hide it. He lived with his mother, pretended he was looking for a job, lied about where he went and what he did. But you can't hide a heroin addiction for very long. His mother found out. There were screams, tears, ultimatums. Mike left home, or was kicked out. His memories of that time are hazy. What he clearly remembers is the descent. First, sleeping on friends' couches. Then, in temporary shelters. Then, on the streets. He spent 8 years living on the streets of Detroit. 8 years where each day was a struggle to get enough money for the next fix. 8 years where he lost everything: dignity, health, human connections, and almost, the will to live. Mike hit rock bottom when he woke up in an alley, covered in vomit and blood, with no memory of how he got there. He was 42 but looked 70. His body was destroyed, his mind fragmented. And for the first time in a long time, he had a moment of brutal clarity. He was going to die there, alone, forgotten. Just another veteran the country had used and discarded. But in that moment of clarity, something else emerged. A tiny spark of anger. Anger at having let Vietnam defeat him. Anger at having become exactly what those protesters shouted he was, a waste. And with that anger came a decision. A decision he wasn't sure he could carry out, but that he needed to try. He wasn't going to die like this. Mike dragged his body to a veterans shelter he'd heard about years before. He knocked on the door. And when they opened it, he said just 3 words: "I need help." Those 3 words saved his life. Because on the other side of that door was someone who understood. Someone who had fought the same internal battles. Someone who didn't judge him, didn't turn their back on him, but simply said, "Come in, let's figure this out together." The rebuilding process was long and painful. There's no such thing as quick transformation when you've spent decades destroying yourself. Mike entered treatment for addiction. The first few weeks were pure hell. His body craved the drug. His mind created elaborate justifications for why he should quit. But there was a psychologist at the shelter, a Korean War veteran named Dr. Harrison, who simply wouldn't give up on him. Dr. Harrison understood something fundamental. Mike's addiction wasn't just chemical, it was a form of emotional survival. So, while treating the physical dependence, they also needed to address the trauma that fueled it. It was the first time in his life that Mike truly spoke about Vietnam, about the friend who died in his arms, about the ambush where he was the sole survivor of his platoon, about the overwhelming guilt of being alive when so many others were not. Talking didn't cure Mike, but something started. It opened a pressure valve that had been closed for decades. And little by little, with the help of support groups with other veterans, Mike began to understand that he wasn't alone, that other men carried the same nightmares, and that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to live with it without destroying himself. It was in one of these groups that Mike discovered carpentry. Another veteran mentioned that working with his hands, creating something tangible and beautiful, helped him stay sane. Mike had never worked with wood before, but he decided to try. And something happened when he held those tools for the first time. Something clicked. There was something almost meditative about the process. Measuring, cutting, sanding, assembling. Each step demanded total attention. There was no room for intrusive thoughts, for flashbacks, for guilt. There was only you, the wood, and the creation of something new. And for the first time in decades, Mike felt something akin to peace. He started slowly. Small projects, simple boxes, shelves. But as his hands gained confidence, his projects grew. Tables, chairs, bookcases, and each piece he completed was a victory, proof that he still had value, that his hands, which had held weapons and done terrible things, could also create beauty. Today, Mike is 73 years old. He runs a small program in Detroit where he teaches at-risk youth how to work with wood. Many of these kids come from difficult backgrounds, broken families, gangs, addictions. And Mike understands each of them in a way that few can. He doesn't preach. He doesn't judge. He simply shows them that transformation is possible, that you can hit rock bottom and still rise. "Every table I build is a life I didn't let Vietnam destroy," Mike often says. And he's not just talking about his own life. He's talking about the dozens of young people who have gone through his program and found a purpose, a path, a reason to believe that the past doesn't define the future. Mike's story shows us something fundamental about transformation. It's not linear, it's not quick, and it's definitely not easy, but it is possible, even when everything seems lost. Even when you've spent years, even decades, trapped in a cycle of self-destruction. Change can happen, but it requires a decision, and it requires help. Mike didn't save himself. He needed Dr. Harrison. He needed support groups. He needed a system that finally embraced him instead of rejecting him. But his journey is not unique. There are thousands of stories like Mike's, and one of them belongs to Sarah Chen, a nurse from San Francisco who carried a different kind of burden. Sarah was 22 years old when she volunteered to serve in Vietnam as an Army nurse. She wasn't drafted. She chose to go. And the reason was simple. She wanted to save lives. She wanted to make a difference. She wanted to use her skills for something bigger than herself. What Sarah didn't expect was the scale of the destruction she would find. As a combat nurse, she was on the front lines, in the field hospitals where the wounded arrived in droves. Young soldiers with limbs torn off, burns covering half their bodies, bullet wounds piercing vital organs, and Sarah worked tirelessly, trying to save each one. But she couldn't save them all, not even close. For every soldier who survived, 3 died in her hands. She watched the light fade from their eyes as she held their hands, whispering that everything would be all right, knowing it was a lie. And each death was like a stab in her soul. Sarah returned to San Francisco in 1972, physically intact, emotionally devastated. She had saved hundreds of lives, literally hundreds. But all she could think about were the lives she couldn't save. The faces of those who died haunted her, not in nightmares, in every moment of silence. Every time she closed her eyes, the guilt was overwhelming. Thoughts like, "I should have been faster," or "If I had done things differently, he would have survived," consumed her completely. And the worst part? Nobody understood. Her family was proud of her. Friends said things like, "You did the best you could." But Sarah couldn't accept that. For her, the best hadn't been enough. She spent 20 years punishing herself. 20 years avoiding any medical situation because the smell of the hospital took her back to those bloody tents. 20 years isolating herself from relationships because she felt she didn't deserve happiness when so many had died. 20 years carrying a weight that was literally killing her from the inside. The turning point came when Sarah, by chance, met another veteran doctor at a community event. They started talking. And for the first time, Sarah was talking to someone who understood exactly what she had been through. Someone who carried the same guilt, the same feeling of inadequacy. And in that conversation, something opened up. Comment below, "Transformation is possible." Because what follows will show you how the decision to speak up, to share, to not carry this burden alone, can literally save lives. They embarked at 19 years old, believing in honor. They returned shattered, rejected, broken in ways no one had prepared them to understand. But they refused to let Vietnam have the last word on who they are. Sarah founded that support group for military healthcare veterans. And what began as 5 people sitting in a circle in a borrowed room transformed into a network of hundreds of professionals who finally had a safe space to talk, to cry, to admit they carried guilt, to hear from others who understood that pain exactly. She discovered something Mike had also discovered. You don't forget, but you learn to carry it differently. The trauma doesn't disappear. The memories don't fade. But when you stop carrying it alone, when you share the weight with someone who understands, it becomes more bearable. And over time, that weight that seemed to crush you begins to transform into something different. into purpose, into wisdom, into strength to help others who are in the same dark place where you were. Today, Sarah is a therapist specializing in PTSD. She works primarily with veterans, but also with anyone who has survived profound trauma. And she has saved countless lives through listening, through simply being present and saying, "I understand, and you are not alone." She transformed the pain that nearly killed her into the tool she uses to heal others. The legacy of pain that Mike, Sarah, and thousands of other veterans carry is not just about survival, it's about rebirth. They teach us that resilience isn't about being strong all the time. It's about breaking down completely and still choosing to get back up. It's about hitting rock bottom and discovering that even from there, there's a way back. They teach us about forgiveness. Not the easy, superficial forgiveness, but the deep, painful forgiveness you need to give yourself. Forgiveness for surviving when others didn't. Forgiveness for not being perfect. Forgiveness for taking so long to heal. Mike took decades. Sarah did too. And that's okay. Transformation has no deadline. And perhaps the most powerful lesson is this. The war broke them, yes, but they rebuilt themselves stronger from the cracks. Not because the trauma strengthened them. That's a romantic lie people tell. The trauma destroyed pieces of them that will never return. But the decision not to let the trauma win, to transform that pain into purpose, to use their own wounds to heal others, that's what made them extraordinary. Their stories now span generations. The young people Mike teaches woodworking are learning more than just carpentry. They're learning that you can start over, that past mistakes don't define you forever, that even coming from the darkest place, you can still create something beautiful. The people Sarah helps as a therapist aren't just processing trauma. They're seeing firsthand proof that transformation is real, that someone can carry the weight they carry and still live a meaningful life. If they manage to rise from hell, what can you rise from? What is your Vietnam? What is that thing from the past that still haunts you, that still makes you wake up in a cold sweat, that you think defines who you are? What if it doesn't define you? What if it's just a part of your story, not the end of it? The truth is, we all have our own battles. Not all of them are literal. Not all of them involve jungles and gunfire. But they all involve pain. They all involve trauma. And they all give us the same choice that Mike and Sarah faced. Let it completely destroy you or use it to rebuild yourself differently. Transformation isn't about erasing the past. Mike still carries the Vietnam War with him. So does Sarah. But they've integrated that into who they are now in a way that gives meaning to their suffering. And perhaps that's what we can learn from them. That the worst things that happen to us don't have to be the end. They can be the beginning of something completely new. If you've made it this far with me, if this story touched you in any way, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me." Because I want to know that you're here, that you heard these stories and that they meant something to you. If this kind of content resonates with you, subscribe to the channel. I tell stories like this every week, stories of real people who went through hell and came back transformed. Stories we need to hear, especially when it's hard to believe that change is possible. Leave a like too. Not because I need numbers, but because this video took a lot of work, a lot of research, and if it helped you in any way, that helps me keep making more. And look, there's a video over here about people who lost everything and rebuilt from scratch. It directly complements what we've discussed here. Click and continue with me there. The journey doesn't end here.